Welcome, everyone, to Three Voices, Three Visions on the Life and Legacy of James W. Washington, Jr. with Anna Bálint, Carletta Carrington Wilson, and Susan Platt. This is one of two programs we have planned to accompany the Many Hats, One Spirit exhibition, the retrospective exhibition of James Washington's work. The other presentation will be on September 7th with Jun Sekiguchi, let me get all of the names, Esther Irvins, and Stuart Wong, and we're really looking forward to that on September 7th. And I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement. The land on which we gathered is within the ancestral territory of the Suquamish people of clear salt water, Suquamish people. Expert fishermen, canoe builders, and basket weavers, the Suquamish live in harmony with the lands and waterways along Washington's Central Salish Sea, as they have for thousands of years. Here, the Suquamish live and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations, as promised by the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. And to start off our program today, I'd like to introduce our Chief Curator, Greg Robinson.
Thank you, Jenna, and welcome everybody on this beautiful summer day. It's so nice to see so many of you here. There were plenty of other options, I'm sure, of what you could do today. I just wanted to say that this is one of the most meaningful exhibitions, I think, for BIMA and serving our mission, reflecting so much of what our values are. For me personally, as a curator, I've been in the regional art world for about 30 years now, and I had the real honor and pleasure of meeting Dr. Washington and interviewing him twice when I was the new director at Pratt Fine Arts Center in 1995. And I remember him so vividly, how kind, eloquent, kind with his opinions is how I would put it, and how informative he was for information I needed about the early history of Pratt Fine Arts Center. I'd like to thank Jenna and the panel for the program today. I also want to talk just briefly about some of the experiences and process we had putting this exhibition together. I want to thank Dasha Moore, our associate curator, who's not here today, and also the board members of the foundation. The Dr. Washington board is one of the best groups that I've had the opportunity to work with. And I want to thank in particular Laverne Hall, Dr. Hall, and also Christina Reed. Christina's here today for helping really shape some of the early conversations about how we could meet frequently and get this together. And then Carletta Carrington Wilson, also, of course, here today, and Esther Irvin. Carletta really helped guide some of my early understanding about how this could work successfully as a retrospective and some of the important aspects of Dr. Washington's life that we should touch on. And being the historian and former librarian, I'm not sure that you're ever a former librarian, actually, the way that she operates, she just really pulled together so many different ideas. And with an exhibition like this, you always wonder, will you really ever do a great job? There's so much more we could have known, so many more people we could have talked to and things we could research. But Carletta really helped me get to a point where I thought this was something that we could achieve and it was feasible. And Esther Irvin helping to coordinate the artists in residence. We, of course, wanted this to be a living legacy exhibition. And knowing that Dr. Washington passed away, it's been 25 years, and Dr. Hall had told me that there hadn't been a show for about 25 years. Tacoma Art Museum had done something in the convention center, but it just seemed like this was a really pivotal time to make sure his legacy, so many new people have moved to this region, didn't know about him, and also so many people needed a refresher. So I could go on and on about who to thank, and I just appreciate you being here. Of course, Jenna will remind you we have a reception, and at this point, I'll excuse myself for cheese and cracker duty. Thank you.
It's hard to believe that James Washington came out of the Deep South, and the Ku Klux Klan was after his family, all the people in Gloucester, Mississippi, where he was born, and came here, became such an eminent sculptor. It's just an amazing trajectory. I didn't mean to change the slide. His mother was really pivotal in his development. You can read here that she had to send her children to relatives when her husband completely disappeared. He was taken away in the trunk of a car, and they never saw him again. So I think that trunk may not have been a way out. It was a way to get him. So his mother saw him as a young age, sort of messing around with shoe soles, and she apprenticed him to a shoemaker, which I think is pretty sharp. And so he had, of course he didn't make any money from that, but he was doing all sorts of jobs, and shoe repair was just one of them. I put this in early because it's so important to the story. He had a wonderful shoe shop at Fort Lawton, and we'll get to how it came there. But this is in the show, of course. And I was just admiring how much equipment he assembled. And then he hung his own paintings on the wall. So that was a nice way for him to publicize his work. Okay, so in terms of art schooling, it's hard to believe. Formal schooling in the 8th grade, all that was allowed in the South at this time for Negroes. Began painting and drawing on his own in his early teens, and was self-taught through observation, correspondence, courses, and books. It's really amazing. This is a wonderful story. With some of the money I earned shining shoes, I bought crayons. I would take crayons out of my pocket and break them in pieces for my friends. Then I would tell them to draw any shape they wanted on the sidewalk. Without altering their shape, I would draw a picture of a man's head or a body using the mark my friends had made. I just think that's fascinating. While he was in Vicksburg, he started drawing. This is a pastel drawing. And of course, because he was an African American, he had to confine himself to subjects in black neighborhoods. So this is a Baptist church that he drew. His early professional work, he was teaching art and recreation at a Baptist academy in Vicksburg, Mississippi, supported by the New Deal WPA, government subsidies for the unemployed. He installed exhibitions of white artists and told he could not exhibit with them. So as a result, he's very proactive, or he organized the first Negro art exhibition in the state of Mississippi at the YMCA. And one of his themes is, don't let anyone tell you something's impossible. And that's what he lived his life by. He moved to Little Rock, Arkansas in 1941, met the artist Louis Freund, with whom he took some classes. And in Little Rock, he did this lovely pastel drawing of his mother's room, very special in its soft colors. In 1944, he moved to Sinclair Heights, Bremerton, Washington, and his wife, Janie R. Washington, came in November. But he said, if I thought race relations were better in the Northwest, I was in for a surprise. This guy's really articulate. So this is something from his archives, race restrictive covenants, and you see fear and distrust, the spread of segregation, blight. So that's just one document. I cannot believe that the government hired him as an electrician wiring battleships, radios. He'd never done anything like that before, but they probably said, can you wire battleships? And he probably said, yeah, of course. But then it was too much stress, so he moved to Fort Lawton and he ran the shoe shop, which I showed you a picture of before. And then he was transferred another couple of times. And he left the civil service thanks to the fact that his wife was working full-time as a nurse. He became a full-time artist in 1960. And I think all of you have been to this beautiful historic landmark house, 1991. It was landmarked through the foresight of the Washingtons. And I'm just showing you the front. There's a whole lot behind. I think someone else is showing that. This is very interesting. So he started interracial exhibitions at Mount Zion Baptist Church, and they went on for a very long time. He included white artists, including like Kenneth Callahan, who was the director of the Seattle Art Museum, and University of Washington professors. Benjamin Davis was a supporter of his. He made some very important civil rights art, and I was so happy to see this work in the show. I've written about it, but I've never seen it. And it was much smaller than I expected, but it blows up really well. So this tiny little wooden carving, which shows a black hand over the ballot box. Let's see, this is the pointer, you can see that. And then this Ku Klux Klan head with a noose. I guess that's supposed to be a cross. And the all-seeing eye. You saw it upstairs, it's very small. And then these two paintings, I thought they were huge. They hold up really well being blown up. And this is, you see the shocked face in the lower right corner, excluded from the UN Charter. And these clippings all refer to that, so he's using collage now. And then this other one, discrimination on housing. But what you actually see, democracy lynched, that Statue of Liberty, and here's a family of black people being actually hung. It's really specific. In 1951, he took a trip to Mexico and met Diego Rivera and Siqueiros. And when he was at Teotihuacan, he picked up a small piece of lava, which would change the direction of his career. In 1956, he made this small sculpture, which is in the show. Let's see, there it is. 1956, of a young boy from Athens. And then this other piece, also in the show, is from 1961. So these are very early. He met Martin Luther King in 1954 in Los Angeles. And this is his early sculpture that was donated to the Smithsonian in memory of his family, of the young queen of Ethiopia. He did a huge trip of 17 countries, and he stopped at the pyramids. I think you can see him. I'm pointing at him. And then, not long after that trip, he did this wonderful portrait bust of Kenyatta. While he was commuting by ferry to Bremerton, he was sketching on newspapers all the time. I wonder where these are now, speaking of archival preservation. But he was very active in the civil rights movement with NAACP and CORE. And he joined a picket line as a leader at the AMP on Capitol Hill, etc. He met Jacob Lawrence in 1961, first contacted to participate in an art exhibition to raise money to support the Freedom Riders. There he is in the middle. And then this beautiful piece, which I believe Carletta is also going to be talking about. No, you're not. There's a chapter in your book about it, right? Yeah. Oh, by the way, her book is fabulous. You must buy it. Kinship of All Life is in the public library, and it's really an unusual piece with the symbolism on each side, 7, 3 divine numbers. It's on the 5th floor of the public library, and you can, 8th? Oh, okay, 8th floor. I think they moved it, maybe. You can see that all sides are covered with symbols. I'm not going to go into them right now because I wanted to talk about the Rotunda of Achievement, which is something I was personally involved with. So he was invited by Leon Sullivan to create a Rotunda of Achievement of major black art people. And so this was the idea that they were shown on busts. But very shortly after they were installed, the next day, they were defaced. So they were taken off exhibition. They were lost until 2009, I believe it was, when I discovered them buried in a closet. I'll show you a picture in a minute. But let's look at these stunning sculptures. I'm sure they meant a lot to him. Frederick Douglass, George Washington Carver, Benjamin Banneker, Manat Turner, and here he is with Martin Luther King. But this is how they looked when I found them. You can see they were defaced, and they were stuck in a closet. I have no idea whether they've been reinstalled or not. Maybe Christina knows, I don't know. So let's go on to the next phase, these wonderful sculptures of birds, and I feel like they're really special for him, really close to his heart. This is just a couple of pieces from the show. And then he also has done a lot of public art. And this piece is in the Sheraton Hotel. This piece is at Mount Zion Baptist Church, the Oracle of Truth. You can just go there and see it. And then he did a whole series of sculptures on the campus in Olympia of Mysteries of Life. Here you see, those are birds, etc. I don't have time to talk about all the symbolism in these today, but they're really stunning. This piece is near Odessa Brown Children's Clinic, Yesler Way on 21st Street, if you want to go see it. It's just beautiful. And this is also Yesler Way, Bailey Elementary. Oh, they're white. Okay, I'm going to turn to the Artist in Residence program now, because that's part of our show. And can you? I don't know if you can read that or not. Can you read it? Yes. Okay. This was a quote that I got from Tim Detweiler, who oversaw a great many artists in residence. And this was what he told me. The residence program was one of the clear interests of James Washington. While organizing his abundant papers, I found a small note that read that he wanted the foundation to support an art residency not dependent on race. The first residency was timed with the opening of the Northwest African American Museum in 2008. Daniel Minter was the inaugural resident, and he gave a talk at the museum. Each residency was 1 month long. There were two kinds, local and state. We received money from several nonprofits to help with the residency, but most of the funding came from a substantial gift from the Jacob Lawrence and Gwendolyn Knight Foundation. So I think that's a very important statement by Tim, and I'm really sorry he can't be here today. So Daniel Minter was the first artist, and this is one of his paintings. I have a whole lot of images of him at work, but this was a wonderful sculpture that he made with various tools that he found, and there's a close-up of some of them. I think it's a beautiful piece. In the 1990s, this is my favorite quote, "I used my imagination to accomplish things other people assured me were impossible." And you see him here with the Fountain of Truth from 1995. It was I think it's his last sculpture. And then it's been, as many of you know, it's been restored and moved to 24th and Union. And this was at the rededication of it. The pink salmon are one side, and then this side with the salmon perhaps dying, I'm not sure, the other side. And of course in the middle is the wonderful sculpture by Barry Johnson of Washington, which we have upstairs, a copy of Washington holding a small bird. All right, this is the installation that you come to if you enter the exhibition from the staircase. I think it's fabulous. There's a force which makes things come alive, if the sculpture's alive or dead, depending on whether it possesses this quality or is void of it. So here's another artist in residence at work. I have quite a few images, but I couldn't show them all. Marita Dingus, who has a small red figure in the show, but this is what she did during the residency. She used Washington's sewing machine and she made boots. Now, how can you get better than that in terms of honoring Washington? Beautiful boots. So that's Marita, and then Romson. He has a couple of really beautiful pieces upstairs, but in this environment, he installed work in the greenhouse, of which we will hear more, right, of Carletta? Yes. And then, of course, our wonderful Carletta. The house stands firm. She will be talking about that. Another installation in the greenhouse. I thought I'd include these, Carletta, because I don't think you have many slides in your show about it. The Bloodline, which was a piece that Carletta created in the garden of the Washington House. And you can see the red line making its way through the garden, and it came through a crack in the glass to the greenhouse. It was very, very moving. Here's Carletta in the studio room where she worked, and behind her are some of the stunning collages which you see upstairs, with the central image taken from Harper's Weekly in 1961. Christian French is another artist who was working. You can see before him are rows and rows of Polaroids that he took of various rocks in the Washington environment, and that's his totem, which you will see upstairs of the rocks. And then Jun Sekiguchi, who's speaking here on September, remind me, 7th. has a beautiful piece in the exhibition upstairs. The piece on the left is the one she created during her residency, and you can see that this piece upstairs is a major expansion of it. It's basically a rope that she tied together, and it's just really gorgeous. Here she is tying the rope together. And I put this in because I just thought this was an interesting technique. This is Mary Koss, and she put in these rusted suitcases. I think the suitcases come from the Washington House, and she's talking about migration and immigration and her own family's history and The Wire. The Wire has a lot of words in it. And then Kristen Matrix, because I really like this piece so much, Lift Every Voice and Sing. It's made completely from hymnals. All of these little squares that you see here are, each one of these is a hymnal. So it's really quite amazing. I hope that the things I have said, this is Washington, of course, bear out that once you find yourself, and once you become cognizant of your innermost force, and once you utilize that force in your work, the very gates of hell cannot retard your progress. He was so amazing. Okay, Anna, you're on.
Thank you, Susan. So I wanted to start with this image of Mr. Washington, even though what I'm going to be talking about is mostly not having to do with his art at all, but except indirectly, but the garden. But this particular image really struck me, the kind of expression on his face, this contentment and the sense of a sort of spiritual engagement that he has with sculpting this stone. And I was thinking about this, yes, but this is also happening within this environment of place, within the studio that was at the end of his garden in the house where he lived, and in a sense was part of that garden. I sort of wanted to put a quote to go under this, so I'm going to read it because I didn't actually get to put it there. Mr. Washington, in my work with stone, it is as if nature speaks and I listen. Then I speak, and with the help of my hands, we speak together. And I think that sort of really actually sets things up real well, that engagement with the spirit inside of things. And I decided that for my talk today, I really wanted to focus on place, the place being their home, but not in its entirety of house, garden, and studio, but to focus on the garden for a couple of reasons. One, that's really where I first encountered the whole experience of Mr. Washington and his spirit, his work, through Carletta's Artist in Residence, the exhibit and installations that she did, which was a stunning experience that I mean, it really, really kind of went to my core. And it was more of a historical and spiritual journey than just like going to an exhibit. And it had taken place mostly in the garden and had engaged with things in the garden in many, many different ways, some of which Susan sort of indicated, and there's no time to go into here. But all of it left me with this feeling of needing to return. Carletta's installation and exhibit was going to be gone, but the garden and the place as a whole was not. And I needed to go back there and see if I could sort of feel a reconnection with the energy that I picked up on that night. And so I did, but that was many, many years ago. And it was again, it's sort of like, yes, this garden speaks to me. So in wanting to go more into that for today, I thought, well, I need to go back to the garden again, because all that was kind of like way back, more than 10 years ago now. On gardens, this is one of the reasons that I also wanted to focus on the garden, is because gardens are alive. It's a legacy that's actually living and changing and breathing. And that in and of itself is, I mean, that's one of the reasons I love gardens so much. But for that very reason, I also needed to go back and re-experience it in the now. So Carletta gave me a little tip-off. She says, well, go on a Tuesday, because that's when the foundation, when the house is open, etc., and that's when the gardener's there. And he probably can help you out. So the very next day was Tuesday, which was 5 days ago from now, and so I went there. Okay, but before I jump into that, I'm just going to backtrack a little bit into the Washington's life, if I can. I have to put my glasses on. Here they are, before they got to the Pacific Northwest, a young couple. And I wanted to show this image because they were so long in that house, over half a century. They came to the Pacific Northwest and decided they wanted to stay and live in Seattle and went in search of a home. And this is the home they found. This is 1816 26th Avenue. Probably it wasn't, this photo was probably taken sort of some years before they moved in, and it probably wasn't quite that barren when they moved in, but I think it looked more like that than the house that we know and recognize now. And I was interested too when I found out Mr. Washington's reasons for that house. And so in his own words, he says, "The reason we chose this house is the congenial atmosphere it seemed to offer. When you select something, the vibes should play a part in whether the something is congenial to you. You feel at ease. You feel free. You get a spiritual awakening." I love his use of the word vibes. Well, it seems that they definitely picked the right place because they lived there for the rest of their lives, like I say, for more than 55 years. But of course, it didn't stay like this image. We know it more to look something like this, which is sort of more towards the end of their time there, when it looks very cozy and welcoming. And during all those years, it was sort of an ongoing project to nurture and develop that property. And I'm going to, again, focus on the garden. I mean, it was going on in the house and then later in the studio too. But from very early on, the creation of a garden began. And it should be noted that in 1947, as if he didn't have enough that he was already doing, Mr. Washington earned a certificate in landscape design and gardening, which I think is itself an indication of how important the garden was to him. It's also interesting to note that in building the garden and creating it, he wanted to make sure that it contained like spiritual places and places of contemplation and refuge. All of which, of course, when I went there, I discovered them there. Okay, so now I really want to jump ahead to what happened when I went last Tuesday. Because here, okay, I drove up. Here's the welcome of the house. Its front steps up to the front door, except I wasn't going to the house itself. So I kind of moved to the left of the house, towards the garden. And the first thing you encounter is this structure. And there, just to the left of that structure, I spotted the gardener, who waved to me and said, "Can I help you?" So I explained to him, who I was, why I was there, and he immediately was like, "Well, would you like me to show you around?" "Sure." And he says, "Hi, my name's Melvin, by the way." So here he is. Okay, so I can't do anything in the way that it actually unfolded because it would be way too confusing. So you have to imagine a little bit. He's taking me around the garden and pointing out things as we go and sort of referencing them in relationship to Mr. Washington and his life, etc. And meanwhile, I'm so, wait a minute, how long have you been doing this? "Well, I've been coming back every Tuesday for the past 3 years. Ever since I retired, I come back here, I want to be at the garden. I'm trying to nurture it, restore it, etc. But as he was taking me around, I'm realizing, this goes further back than 3 years. He's telling me about things that go way back, but it's like Mr. Washington told him this. So his story is kind of coming along and coming out parallel to going around the garden. But I'm going to divide it up. Take you guys around the garden first, and then bring you back to his story. So this is actually my very favorite place in the garden, which is the pool at the top, very top of the garden when you come in, with the lovely kind of babbling noise that's constant and just very, very soothing. And of course, birds come here, frogs, all kinds. But one of the things that Melvin pointed out to me right away is, and I want to draw your attention to the left of the tree. Oops, you see that little structure with kind of blue legs on it? Okay, this next picture is right next to that. You can see the blue legs in here. And you can see on the side of that structure, there's a little carving sort of into the rock of a bird, and it says JWW 1974. On the other side of this stone, and I was unable to photograph it, I couldn't get the right angle, there's a symbol of an onyx that he carved. So Melvin tells me how he found this kind of buried and covered in dirt and kind of pulled it out and cleaned it up and sort of like put it back into the garden as part of the garden, which was my first sort of tip-off that, whoa, this guy really knows the garden. We're walking down, it's on a hill, as you saw in that first picture of the house. It's on a hillside and has a territorial view to a hillside going up sort of like across the valley. So at this point, we're going down towards the bottom of the garden, and this is something you pass along the way, and you can see here the steps coming down, and you can see that little sculpture nesting there. Exactly how that fits into things, I don't know. Melvin didn't know either, but it was one of the things that Mr. Washington had gathered. And of course, we passed stones. Lots of egg-shaped stones among them, and I should just share with you that after that first visit for Carletta's residency, I was so moved about the whole thing about the egg and the stone as I learned and read about Mr. Washington that I began collecting my own egg-shaped stones, and I have now quite the collection, and I can make every bit as good a pile as this. Here are more. I'm not quite sure what the holes through them symbolize.
That's Romson.
Ah, okay, thank you. Okay, now this looks like a rock, but it's actually petrified wood. And there's quite a lot of petrified wood that Mr. Washington collected that's here and there in the garden. I was particularly drawn to this piece, so I photographed it. Okay, here, this area with the bamboo, which Melvin was explaining how he'd sort of like, that had gotten really, really out of control, and he was having to kind of tame it a little bit. But also that he built this fence up above it because there was a drop-off there that was dangerous. And how he used the bamboo to build the fence. Rather than going to Lowe's or somewhere, he wanted to actually draw from the garden itself. These are some of the things that are sort of next to that area with the ferns and the bamboo. This, it looks like a sculpture, and I think it is a sculpture of nature's. It's a piece of wood. But isn't it gorgeous? And here, of course, is the studio. This isn't my photograph, but I had to have a photograph, so I'm using this one. And you can see how it nestles at the bottom of the garden. And of course, some of that was really practical because trucks could come in and deliver stones in the alley that ran along the back there. But it's also, becomes a feature and part of the garden itself. To the right of those steps as we were coming down towards the studio, you see this huge, huge stone, which you saw in some of the photographs that Susan just showed, that Carletta's Bloodline of Time used this stone. And it's now, Melvin's trying to clear it, free it, so that it can breathe again because it was just completely buried. Here, we're now right at the bottom, behind the studio, and right up against the fence that looks out onto the alley. And this rock that to me looks like a rabbit is sitting on what I think Melvin thought was probably a pedestal that came from a gravestone. And that Mr. Washington, when somebody was going to make a new grave, he would go and get the old stone and stuff, and and use these things in different ways. Now, this was very interesting. You see, this sign is huge, and it says Washington. And it was from the University of Washington. I didn't know this, but apparently the early campus was downtown. And this was the sign. And when they moved it to where it is now, Mr. Washington went and said, "Hey, do you mind if I have that sign?" And there it still is. And lastly, you can see behind the fence are these rocks that were delivered, intended to be sculpted, and have been sitting there and sort of like turning into their own art objects as they gather moss and change for all these years. Okay, so then Melvin, we come back up to the garden. And this is where I'm going to start sharing his story. It turned out that he'd known Mr. Washington, Mr. and Mrs. Washington, since he was 17 years old. That he first met them in 1972. That he was a kid that lived down the street, who at the time had an enormous afro, and who just by chance one day, he and Mrs. Washington sort of, I don't know if they were the bus stop or what exactly, but they encountered one another, and she started, chatting and asking questions, and found out that he was looking for a job. And she said, well, come on over tonight. Come over to our place and eat and meet Mr. Washington. So, okay, Melvin goes up there with his enormous afro. And Mr. Washington takes one look at him and says, "Young man, if you want to get somewhere in life, the first thing you need to do is get you a haircut." And Mrs. Washington is like, "Oh, hush, hush, leave the boy alone." And he's, "Yes, get yourself a haircut." So that's kind of how it started. And Mrs. Washington was the one that took Melvin under her wing and actually helped him get a job at the hospital where she worked. And that turned out real well because Melvin went on to get his license as a licensed vocational nurse. And nursing was what he did for his entire working life, something that started under the sort of like mentorship of Mrs. Washington. However, he was a sort of a regular visitor to the house for the next 28 years. So by the time that 28 years was up, he's 45. But early on in that period, he got a haircut. And Mr. Washington, so he and Mr. Washington kind of buddied up a bit after that. And Mr. Washington started really taking Melvin under his wing. He'd take him out in the garden. He taught him about plants. He taught him about soil. He taught him about how to fix things, how to use your imagination and be creative and get things done. And all this was transformative for Melvin. He had his job, but this was like a spiritual education, and also one that made use of his own gifts with his hands and fixing things. No, he wasn't an artist, but he sure knew how to, problem solve and get things done and fix. And it should be mentioned that the mirror that's out there as part of the exhibit of the living space of the Washingtons, that mirror was really beat up around the frame and broken. And who do you think fixed it? Melvin. The sewing machine that showed up in Susan's picture, that is in need of all kinds of repair, who do you think's fixing it right now? Melvin. So the reason he came back after all these years, when he retired, he came back, was because of how important the garden and the Washingtons had been to him, how much they were part of his life, and that garden had been part of his life. And that's why he was there. So it was time for me to go by then. So, we said our goodbyes and exchanged phone numbers, and he actually gave me a photograph of himself with the afro, and I should have included it, but I didn't. But I wanted to share his parting words. He said, every Tuesday when I'm here, every week, I feel their energy. It's as if they're actually here. I feel their spirit in everything that I do. And it's a beautiful connection because when I go home, it's like I'm energized for the rest of the week. And I thought, that right there is really, really something. It was a beautiful way of expressing what the garden and the Washingtons had meant to him. But as I drove away, it occurred to me that Melvin himself is a legacy of Mr. Washington's life. He's a living legacy. And that there's probably no other person alive who knows, loves, and has such a rich history with that garden and such a deep spiritual attachment to it as Mr. Melvin Kelly. And that his coming back after his retirement is his way of giving back and gifting back what he received. And that's where I want to end this.
First, I want to thank Anna and Susan for their beautiful presentations, and I thank you for joining me this afternoon. I couldn't ask for two better portraits of the Washingtons and their work. I thank you. A speculative inquiry into the origins of the Washington Library and its foundation as the inspiration for the creation of the poem of Stone and Bone. With imagination, you can go into an unknown world and bring into a material world things beforehand had never been seen before. Aunt Betsy's Cabin, Aiken, South Carolina, 1876. For these women and children, little has changed on this post-emancipation day, except for that girl brazenly staring into a book. 13 years ago, this would be a crime scene. In 1876, more than 90% of the formerly enslaved were illiterate. The skills of reading and writing just as elusive in the 20th century as they were in the 19th century, for some, but not all. The formerly enslaved survived as late as 1941, and so in the community in which young Washington grew, there were certainly family members, neighbors, and church members negotiating the unsettling circumstances of freedom. The book was still a forbidden object, laden with fear and a sense of threat. If someone opened a book, jabbed at the page, and challenged them to read what was there, they would not be able to recognize their own name. Those two women know that there are people who look like them, who do not live in windowless shacks. They stare at their better clothes, better shoes, know that they can make sense of the squiggly lines of a letter, the rows running across the page of a newspaper, or adding heft to the weight of a book. On the other hand, these hands know how to read a body before a word can slip through a lip. Better yet, they read rows after rows of a field, every turning leaf telling them a tale. There were two things to accomplish: learning how to spell, how to write your name, and to be able to read the Bible. The Talking Book, African Americans and the Bible. In North Carolina, The patrols were ordered to search every Negro house for books or prints of any kind. Bibles and hymn books were particularly mentioned. My master used to read prayers in public to the ship's crew every Sabbath day. And when I first saw him read, I was never so surprised in my life as when I saw the book talk to my master. For I thought it did as I observed him to look upon it and move his lips. I wished it would do so with me. As soon as my master was done reading, I followed him to the place where he put the book, being mightily delighted with it. And when nobody saw me, I opened it and put my ear down close upon it in great hopes that it would say something to me. But I was very sorry and greatly disappointed when I found that it would not speak. This thought immediately presented itself to me, that everybody and everything despised me because I was black. That's in this book, the talking book. Sorry, I managed to delete the original. Books are not to be put in their hands. The Bible, a tool of enslavement and emancipation, served as a gateway to literacy for a captive people. It was not only the first book for many, but the only book a family might ever own, the Bible serving a multiplicity of purposes. There, the family documented births, marriages, and deaths. It functioned as a reader, gave solace, hope, and comfort, strengthened them in countless ways. They sought insight into the never-ending dilemma of their days. For non-Muslim West Africans, their first encounter with books was a thing of mystery, a kind of magic by which their captors held them under its spell. Yeah. But I don't usually say much about when I was born. I didn't know nothing about it. But then, if you ask me how old I am, if somebody wanted to know, I couldn't very well tell them. Because from my reading of this thing in the Bible, I read 103 Psalms, and it says that God furnished you food to eat that's good to your taste, and with that food, he renew your youth as he renews the eagle. So I don't know how many times I've been renewed. That is all I know about it. Isn't that funny? Well, Washington's birth year has been given as, I found in sources, 1908, 1909, and 1911. However, in the 1930 census for New Orleans, his age is given as 28, which would make his birth year 1902. The Washington Foundation gives 1911 as the official birth date. I was thinking that the only way someone could conceive of building a home library, dedicating more than shelves lining a wall in a room, but whose sole purpose was the enterprise of reading, of soaking up knowledge from disparate minds. They would have had to have thought about this for some time. Make sure that it would be a permanent place, at best a home one owned, or a very long time rental. They would have had to have the foresight to begin collecting, setting aside funds in anticipation of the time and the means to follow one's intellectual pursuits. So where did Washington get the idea to build a library? Was it in Gloucester? I had people there who own a hotel, my aunt and others. In 1900, the population of Gloucester was about 1,600. In 1910, 1,400 people lived in Gloucester. In 1920, the population was 1,079, the majority being Negroes. In 2020, the population was listed as 897, 70% being African American. This image is from 1903. This is a map of the confluence of the Mississippi, Louisiana, and the Gulf of Mexico. Well, I wanted to know about the foundational landscape and the people that shaped and influenced James W. Washington, Jr. He mentioned a sawmill town. I really wondered, where were those plantations and on what Indian lands those towns and plantations sat? But first, there was the Mississippi River to take into account. That meandering, mossy green ribbon of a river running down a map all the way from Minnesota, dividing Mississippi from Louisiana, dashing down in a flash into the wide-mouthed Gulf of Mexico. Right there is right about where Gloucester is. You'll see it on another map. This is Amite County, Mississippi. But I do want to show you here, right here. Right here, do you see this? This confluence of Mississippi, Louisiana, and New Orleans. I used to work with a banana messenger out of New Orleans. I would go from Gloucester to New Orleans. It was my job to see that the fruit is ripened or began to get ripe before we'd get to Mississippi. This is 1930, before Susan's exploration of all his work in art. On the left, you can see the river boats landing for the Mississippi River. On the right-hand side, however, I want to say that Washington comes from Gloucester down to New Orleans, only to travel back up into Mississippi. I wondered, how far into Mississippi did that train go? Washington was traveling great distances in this work, meeting all kinds of people, working for all kinds of people. The man who employed him for the bananas was Italian, and did not harbor the entrenched prejudices of the Southerners. So, on this image on the right, you see that's the train right there, the train car, and you see how close it's sided up to that boat. I looked at, you can't see these faces clearly, but there's not one African American face in this photograph. I believe that all those men who are carrying those bananas are Italians. So he was already a traveler. In a little more than 10 years, Washington would be on the other side of the country. So here is a larger map, and you can see right there, I don't even have to point it out. You can see right there, Amite, and there you go, with Gloucester right on that railroad line. Gloucester, Amite County, Mississippi, is an incorporated post town on the divide between the branches of the Mississippi and Amite rivers. It is an import station of the Yazoo and Mississippi River Valley Railroad, 144 miles north of New Orleans. The town was laid out in 1883 in what was then a pine forest and is now a thriving little city with a considerable cotton and lumber shipping business. And this is 1907. Well, there you go. The vast pine forests of the Choctaws and Chickasaws gave way to logging. And look at this historic range of the longleaf pine forest. You see, it stretches all the way up to Virginia, unbroken. But in the photograph here, we see the logs, or there again, the railroad car waiting to receive the logs. Wow. And there were cotton plantations, as some of us already knew. On the left, an image of a cotton gin at the Dahomey Plantation, 1890. The first enslaved people who found themselves sold to the Dahomey plantation in Dahomey, Mississippi, came from the Dahomey peoples of Africa direct. Most likely, some of their descendants were still labored there post-emancipation. Some of you know that the women warriors featured in the recent film Woman King were from Dahomey. On the right, the loading wagon with cotton grown by Negro farmers at Mound Bayou, Mississippi, 1910. Now, these images are 20 years apart, but look at the stark difference in the settings. From a chaos of cotton to neatly packed bales in wagons, or neatly, there's the bales, but neatly packed wagons. Mound Bayou was an all-black town with an amazing history. More on this as we continue to travel. The Great Leap. All right, I noticed that I have all my dates wrong. Susan and Anna have it, but bear with me. We're in the 1940s. Well, I view myself as not totally self-taught, but picking up information of education everywhere, in books, and observing, and thinking, and just picking it up wherever it's at. It's out there, and you have to get it. If I had had somebody to teach me sculpting, I wouldn't be doing the things that I'm doing now. The 1940s were a pivotal decade for the Washingtons. The early 40s find them in Little Rock. They jettisoned to the Northwest, first to Bremerton, then to Seattle. I thought it would be interesting to make the comparison between Main Street, Gloucester, and this is 1948, so they were already here, and then Little Rock, Arkansas, and then here, the Bon Marché, which, well, I don't know if it's not called the Bon Marché, but right there at Seattle, 1945. I wanted to learn more. I always wanted to, as it were, leapfrog in knowledge. Leapfrog in knowledge. That is, when I get to one thing that I figured out, I always want to pursue its potential further. What were the Washingtons leaping away from? Which will make this next slide make sense. Negro jailed for entering library. For the crime of simply entering the local library, George Raymond, member of Corps Task Force, was arrested and jailed. "You know you don't belong here," the library assistant yelled. Well, what happened in 1964 was that finally the Civil Rights Act granted access to all public facilities, including libraries. However, in the 1940s, public libraries were segregated. There was a vast difference between Negro libraries and those provided for whites. It wasn't until the 1960s civil rights movement that things changed. The seed of the library had to already have been planted long before they landed in the Northwest. Despite emancipation, literacy was illegal for the formerly enslaved. In the period of the 1940s to the 1960s, the entrenched system of segregation hindered access to the fonts of knowledge, books, magazines, newspapers, correspondence. The books they had access to in schools when they were able to attend, and Negro libraries were old, damaged, and unapologetically racist. However, the first free public library for African Americans in Mississippi was the Mound Bayou Library, 1910 to 1935. That puts Washington living in Mississippi in this time span. It was one of the first African American public libraries in the nation. Booker T. Washington interceded in behalf of Negro municipality. Citizens and town officials appropriate funds to purchase site. Work on a new building will be started at once. People very jubilant over the addition to their home. Charles Banks, banker and merchant, was prime factor in movement. And here is Charles Banks in his private library in 1917. Now, I posit if you removed Charles Banks from the center of that image, you would not assume that this was the library of an African American man. I say, on the plantation landscape, it was a huge landscape, and life was different for people who lived in the quarters and the people who had access to the big house. This library, as you can tell, is mirrored on the library of a plantation owner. But Mount Bayou had a U.S. post office, 6 churches, banks, stores, and several public and private schools. Its economy depended on the production of cotton, timber, and corn. Politically, Mount Bayou's mayor, Isaiah Montgomery, protected it from white violence through political accommodation. The library was one of Mount Bayou's key civic developments between 1905 and 1915, a period of substantial growth that began with the opening of the Bank of Mount Bayou in 1904. Charles Banks, a local businessman, helped establish both institutions. Lastly, Banks developed a thriving business infrastructure, complete with a governing body, banks, merchants, cotton gins, and warehouses, and a public school system, all outside the reach of the surrounding white-dominated towns. Who else could have ignited in Washington this idea of building your own personal library, where you did not have to contend with imprisonment for just wanting to read a book? But the plot thickens. Lorraine Hansberry. Lorraine Hansberry's grandfather, Eldon Hayes Hansberry, born on the cusp of emancipation, either 1894, 1895, yes, in Gloucester, of whom it was said, established a fine family library, replete with world classics, works of Black writers, and an encyclopedia that was expanded upon by 3 or more generations. He was a professor at Alcorn A&M in 1871. Couldn't be, that's not right. But he was a professor at Alcorn A&M. Alcorn is the oldest historically Black land grant institution in the U.S. I think that's the origin of Alcorn. The Hansberrys were academics and scholars. Her father's efforts to purchase a property in a white neighborhood was the plot, the seminal plot for her A Raisin in the Sun. And it says, of her own drama, which became A Raisin in the Sun, one might argue that the true seed of her writing, the drama, germinated on the shelves of the library at her grandfather Eldon's home in Gloucester, Mississippi, more than 60 years earlier. So are you connecting the dots? Yeah. All right, we're almost done. There's one more clue to this tale. The Freemasons. Mr. Washington was a Mason, and the Freemasons were prominent in Mississippi as early as 1868. Mr. Washington was a 33rd degree Mason of the Right Consistory and a member of the Hercules Lodge number 17 here in Seattle. There was a presence, as there were a presence of Freemasons here. And Mr. Washington used symbols found from or drawn from Masonic rites. There was another Mason clear across the country in New York that I am sure drew his attention, and that would be Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. Has anyone heard of him? Yes. Yes. Here we go. And there he is. Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, a grade school teacher, told him that Negroes had no history, heroes, or accomplishments. Well, he set out to prove her wrong, and while supporting himself and his family, he began writing, publishing, and collecting books on the African diaspora. His private collection, named the Schomburg Collection of Negro Literature and Arts, was purchased by New York Public Library with Carnegie funds in 1926. At his death in 1938, Schomburg had collected 10,000 books, 3,000 manuscripts, 2,000 etchings, and several thousand pamphlets. So these are the influencers, prominent men who had a public presence, who in spite of obstacles and attitudes subverted the mores of the society in which they found themselves and created their own libraries. Here, I rest my case. I knew about Schomburg and visited the library many, many years ago. But the Washington Library was the first time I encountered in a private residence a library of the scope and depth that the Washingtons created. It was not just an eclectic collection of works mirroring an owner's interest. It mirrored the Dewey Decimal run of a public library, whether it was a small Madrona public library or you're down at this big main library, Seattle Public. All the subjects from religion, the occult, spirituality, electricity, gardening, history, fiction, Intozaki Shange, which I was like, he's reading Intozaki Shange? It was a full collection. So, here we go. This is his library. The Washington Library is estimated to house 3,000 books in addition to scrapbooks and other ephemera. This is the collection where my residency truly began. It exists as the foundation of the work I would accomplish over the month of May 2011. Just as the collection was foundational to my work, this collection was foundational to Washington's visual and intellectual development. It mirrors the general, as I mentioned that general Dewey run. So last, I'll say, I saw one of his books, and I wanted to find it. I wanted to buy one and have it in my library. So this is just 2 shelves, and here are some of the titles: The Magic and Mystery of Tibet, Roll, Jordan, Roll, The White Side of a Black Subject. He has 2 copies of that. Profiles of Courage. It is very interesting to see the range and the depths of the reading that he had in that library. So, I sat in that room for several days, searching title after title, looking for language, the language to work into an entrance, a line that could be followed and take you somewhere in a poem. This is what I found: the unheavenly city, the eternal city. Then I worked and reworked on creating some kind of a narrative: water and ice, the magic of honey, every living creature, a feast of flowers. What is amazing about this process is that it's like putting a puzzle together that you're trying to solve. Disparate pieces or disparate lines begin to connect and create meaning. Then there was a complete poem that ended with, from ether to cosmos, unto thee I grant 7 stars in Orion, the shape of illusion, the magic of obelisk, the edge of infinity, the divining hand, twice soul, twice ransomed. Of course, it is only after you complete a poem that you discover what you did not know. I see the poem as a portrait of Mr. Washington, and that is because the portrait is composed of the titles of books that fed this man's mind. Here I stand, beside the still waters, the man who talks with the flowers, the man who found out why the beautiful ones are not yet born. Hear me talking to ya. I heard the owl call my name. I must add, in the Washington studio, you will find a large stuffed owl. Well, I went from the house library, and in that house library, there were also embossed books. And one day, as I just marveled over them, I decided to create rubbings. Those rubbings ended up in the installation of the house stands firm, and they make a prayer cloth above that. So this is them. And as Anna mentioned, here below are the stones that were found on the property, and at the, it may be hard to see, but right here, you can see they were on the property, just tossed in piles, these maquettes, things that he had begun to carve and then discarded. These are there's a collection when you walk into the studio, directly right to your right, there is the shelf of all art books. I did not find them of any use to me during my residency. They basically were art books that you would, peruse, but I couldn't use the titles. And there's a photograph of Mr. Washington there. All kind of sculpting were in there. So I showed it to the late Ambrose Patterson. He said, well, that's a good book, but I don't know where it's at now. I know it's in my library somewhere. So then when it actually did dawn on me that it was sculpting that I was supposed to do, then I called George Tsutakawa. Let there be sculpture, poems of cabin and field, buried cities recovered, landmarks and surface markings, the evidence of things not seen. Thank you.